We're going to take a look at what happens if we want multiple stacks in our CDK application. So we have a getting started stack at the moment that has an event bridge rule and a Lambda function in. And at the moment, the Lambda function is pretty simple. It just sends an email with SES. But we might want to expand on that. Perhaps we want to put a record in a DynamoDB table every time we send an email, just to say, yep, that happened, there you go. And when we do that, we are probably going to create the DynamoDB table in CDK as well, but we might want it to be in a separate stack. I've seen some people have a stack for long-lived data stores and a stack or multiple stacks for things like Lambda functions that can get thrown away and recreated and aren't really critical because they don't store the data themselves. You know, you could always recreate it with the code. Whereas if you've got a database or an S3 bucket or similar, you can't just recreate it, you've got to get the files or the contents back in. So regardless of your reasoning for wanting multiple stacks, we'll look at how we can achieve that. So I'm going to go to the bin folder here, and you can see we've got our new getting started stack attaching it to the application. And let's create a new class for our DataStoreStack. And then we'll do the same thing again, export class DataStoreStack. We're going to extend stack. We'll create our constructor with the 3 arguments you're very used to now. We have the scope, which is always going to be a construct, the ID or logical ID that's a string, and then the props. And I think for this stack, we're actually just going to use the default stack props object or type here. I don't think there's any need for us to have a custom one. So let's pass these through to the parent constructor, give the file a bit of a format, and then we can have a think about creating our data store. So let's do a DynamoDB table. So I'm going to create a method, and we could say, what will this be? We could have a create notification audit table. There we go. We can write an item into the table every time we send a notification as a means of auditing them. And then we can do a new DynamoDB table. Oops, sorry, it's going to be a new table. There we go. And attach it to the current scope. We'll give it an ID. So let's say notification audit table. And then any properties. So we could do something like changing the billing mode to being on-demand billing or pay per request, I should say. And then we could set a table name if we wanted to. We could set the encryption settings if we want to. But I think that'll do us unless we're required to pass anything in. We've got a partition key. I'm not going to choose a sensible partition key here for this silly little example we're doing. I'm just going to put in any old value. So we'll just have an ID field, which is going to be a string. There we go. We won't go into data store design for audit tables, but there we go. So we've got a little example, a resource that we're getting that we're using, and let's call that from the constructor, and then we can get this stack deployed. So let's go over to the bin folder, and we can do new DataStoreStack. We can attach it to the app. We can call it DataStoreStack or whatever we wanted to, and we can just pass in an empty object for those stack props because we're not overriding anything just yet. So with that done, let's see what happens that is different to how things have been behaving so far in CDK. So if we do an npm run synth, it will say successfully synthesized to this path here, our CDK.out folder, and it says supply a stack ID to display its template. So if we go and have a look at that template.yaml, it's actually now empty. So even though we've tried to redirect it into a file, because we've got multiple stacks going on, we can't just redirect the output of synth into some file or somewhere and just see it at the terminal like we were doing before. So we can pop into CDK.out, we can see our DataStoreStack now has a template JSON file, and we can have a look in there and read through the JSON version if we like, or if we really wanted to. If we really wanted to see the YAML version either just on the console or putting it into a file, then we could specify the stack name after synth. And then there we go. And now it behaves very much like it has been doing so far. The same thing applies with other commands like diff. So when we run a diff, we now have a separate section here for each stack. So that's a little bit different to what we had before, where we just had one. And how about deploy? And now deploy actually gives us an error, and it says, hey, wait a minute, you've got more than one stack, so I need to know which one I should deploy. So we could do npm run deploy, then the DataStoreStack, and then that will deploy as normal. Lovely. And then we could deploy both the stacks or all of the stacks if there are more than two together with the --all option. And if there's a dependency that's formed from the stacks, oops, sorry, because this is a flag, I've got to put the double dashes in to say we're going to pass any of the following arguments to the command being run by npm, so CDK. There we go. So if we've got many stacks, then we can add dependencies in between them if we like. Or alternatively, if we don't want to do that, we can rely on the automatic dependencies that are generated when we reference values between stacks, which is covered in a separate lesson. So it's up to you whether you need that ordering in place and whether you want to add it in explicitly and add that relationship in between the stacks, or whether you're okay just doing cross-stack references if you've got those in your project. So we'll wait for that to deploy. And with that deployed, we can have a quick look at adding in those dependencies. So let's pop over to our bin folder where we've got both stacks, and we're going to stick them into variables. And then let's say that we're going to make the getting started stack depend on the DataStoreStack because it needs it. So let's say getting started stack .node, whoops, .add dependency, and then we can pass in the DataStoreStack like so. And we can just give that another deploy just to make sure it's all still happy. And you can see in the deploy logs there that the DataStoreStack deployed first. So it's definitely happening in that order. All right, so that was a quick look at how we could use multiple stacks in CDK. We added them to the app just like normal. We could add a dependency between them if required, or maybe we'll rely on the cross-stack references, which is covered in another lesson. And then with the commands, we had to adapt things very slightly. So diff worked as is. And for synth, we had to either specify the name of the stack that we're interested in, or we would just rely on them being put into the CDK.out folder. And for deploy, we either had the option of specifying the stack name, or we could use --all and CDK would deploy them in the order that we'd specified.